Welcome to the Engage podcast, brought to you by Boodle, the most rewarding way to pay. If you haven't already, get onto the App Store and download Boodle. That's Boodil. The Engage podcast is where we speak to some of the most inspiring entrepreneurs and business leaders. In today's episode, we are joined by one of the greatest young minds in media and marketing, Oliver Yonchev, the CEO and co-founder of Flight Story, a communications business he founded alongside Dragon's Den host Steven Bartlett. Prior to this, Oliver led the US division of the Social Chain Group, taking it from a startup to hundreds of employees, working with some of the world's biggest brands. Oliver is a well-seasoned public speaker, having given talks at some of the largest marketing conferences around the world. If there is one thing Oliver knows, it is how to effectively get into the consumer's minds and deliver powerful marketing messages. Welcome to the show, Oliver.
Oh yeah, brilliant. So we'll kick things off. I think the question that most people probably want to know is, what's it like being in business with Steven Bartlett?
Tell all. You know what? I've worked with Steve for a long time. And Steve has certain things that he truly has like a remarkable genius. I think he operates in the grey better than anyone. The things that on paper may not seem logical, he has that vision. He's a true visionary. So I think the foundation of how we work together is it starts with respect and admiration. And then beyond that, we draw very clear lines on the role he plays and the role I play. And I think that's how we make it work. And over the course of, 6 or 7 years of knowing each other, I consider him a really good friend, which being in business with friends is, I can't think of anything better.
Yeah.
Annoying at times.
Yeah, it got its challenges.
It's not perfect, but the net positive of being around your friends and working with them, you can't beat it.
That's it. Nice. Well, you've got an amazing career, Ollie. Let's go back to the start. Tell us a bit about your sort of background, where you grew up, and what really gave you that sort of entrepreneurial drive to succeed in business.
Yeah, I'm probably a late stage entrepreneur, but I think I have arguably been an entrepreneur in hiding for some time. So how far back we going? We're going grassroots?
Yeah, let's go grassroots. Let's say a bit about your upbringing and your family background that led to, obviously your days at BBC, then obviously all the way through to Social Chain and Flight Story.
Okay, well, I'll start with when I was growing up, I was going to be a football player. Uncompromising, that was it. There wasn't a plan B. I remember being in like a careers class.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Swindon said to me, "So what are you going to be?" I said, "A football player." She went, "Oliver, no, like
you need to be good at football to be."
Yeah. She just roasted me. Oh, she said, "What are you going to be?" And I was like, "I'm going to be a football player." And I just held that against her, and I was going to prove her. She was absolutely right. Mrs. Swindon was so right. But yeah, I always had a confidence and kind of wanted to do things I enjoyed. And I started with football. In parallel to that, I learned to drum. I had a stint as a musician, failed at that.
Yeah, going down all the stereotypical, childhood dreams: footballer, musician, and
and I've done it all, man. Throughout that journey, I've been in call centers. I've done lots of things I didn't want to do, and then I landed on post my stint as a drummer. I went to university, studied music. And part of my journey there was to learn about marketing and promotion and comms and PR. And I found myself really enjoying that. I really enjoyed the process of learning how people think and feel and the art of business and promotion and marketing. Following that, I took on a internship with the BBC Introducing. I was doing music. So I was doing everything from making cups of tea through to researching artists.
Nice.
And that led me then a little later, once I had a bit of credibility under my belt, I joined a graduate scheme for a company called Bauer Media. Worked in sales and commercial development for about 4.5 years before going onto Facebook one day, seeing a TED talk from Steve, that was about building multi-million-dollar business, knowing nothing about business. It's the perfect title. It speaks to every sort of aspiring entrepreneur. But in parallel to this, while I was at Bauer, not that I had a side, I'll say this for the first time. I did have a side hustle.
Nice.
I set up a website selling bulbs, light bulbs.
Oh, well, interesting. Yeah.
Reason being, I wanted to figure out how do I get something from Alibaba to the UK.
Yeah.
And there was really good margins on light bulbs. And I wanted to learn how to build a website and sell things online. And then I was the person that was perpetually buying domains. I have like 50 domains that probably cost me thousands of
nice.
of like unmet business ambitions. So I'd always been a little entrepreneurial in my wants and desires, never been probably brave enough to take that leap. And Social Chain was a startup, really its infancy. Joined that, and that for me was kind of entrepreneur school. Was through that business from its infancy all the way through to it being a public company and beyond. And that took me to the US. I spent 3.5, nearly 4 years in the US, building the US business, and learned a hell of a lot along the way. And then last year, we decided, Steven and I, that we would set up a new business called Flight Story.
Amazing. Well, what a journey. What a story. So talk to us about Social Chain. Obviously, you spent, I believe, it was around 6 years, was it? Just under 6 years. And that took you from the UK all the way to heading up and managing the US function. So talk to us about what Social Chain taught you, what skills you developed there, and what that, how that led you to, sort of co-founding the business with Steve at Flight Story.
Yeah, I think Social Chain, I reflect a lot on that experience. Having left something that you've done for several years of your life, it's a big part of your identity. Whether at work, whether it's a business, it forms part of who you are, particularly if you really care about your career and profession. I reflect on Social Chain and go, what it taught me is really a business is a collection of people. And we work together, and Social Chain was just a real hotbed of talent.
Yeah.
Maybe not as intentional at the time, but it ended up being that way. But underpinning that was this ambition. There was this kind of we could take over the world mentality that existed. So it taught me a lot of how far you can get with ambition and optimism, despite maybe not having the credentials or experience. And then probably the last thing I learned was the value of having values.
Okay.
If I think about Social Chain, a lot of the values stem from redefining the workplace. That was a part of it. So when you think about policies and how the company tried to treat people, not always getting it right, but the motives and intentions it was very value led, and very good at self-promotion. So all those things I think about a lot. And over the course of seeing a business go from its infancy to, a business that operates across many territories, having gone through those big transactional milestones like a public listing and seeing, the phases of evolution, I think you learn a lot in that process.
100%.
So going into Flight Story, I think we are better equipped. We have a little more experience, a few more resources, a bigger platform. And I conceivably a little better at what we do.
Yeah, nice. Well, before we go to properly into Flight Story, let's go back to Social Chain again. You started the US when there was only a few people within the US business, and took that to circa 100 people and working with some of the world's biggest brands. So talk to us about the difference between the UK business, and obviously that had grown at that point to a few hundred people anyway, to then setting up the US business, and I suppose a bit of the market nuances between the two as well.
Yeah, so I think the biggest learning that when we decided to take the business to the US was you had a really good foundation in the UK, a great reputation, a company that stood for something. If you thought social media in the UK, you thought Social Chain was on the tip of your tongue, or it was in the conversation. We made some wrong assumptions in entering the US that we would have that same admiration or a brand or any cut through. We didn't. So there was a significant period of time where it was almost really building from grassroots and ground up. So you had this seemingly incredibly successful UK marketing business that just no one cared about.
Yeah.
So what that did to me, it taught me a lot about, we have to learn from what the UK had done, but we
Mhm.
have to build something successful in its own right. And again, that started with finding the right people.
Mhm.
The great thing about New York, it's an incredible talent hub. New
Yeah.
York's this just mecca of, you know, wealth, poverty, clash of cultures. You've got the hustlers, you've got the really well educated, you've got all these things conflating, and it creates a really sort of special environment. So we had a great talent pool, we built some good teams. I suppose one of the bigger learnings that we took into the US, it was very important if you enter the US that you have US roots.
Mhm.
Americans don't like to work transiently, even that we
Okay.
had this big global brand body of work through Social Chain UK didn't really matter in the US as much. It was so important that we established some roots. And I would say one of the bigger difference in terms of how business is conducted, I think there is more formalities
Yeah.
to US business. It's a little more transactional.
Mhm.
I think we're a little more human this side of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Atlantic in how we conduct ourselves. So my job was to lean into some of those advantages. The
Yeah.
way we conduct ourselves was different in the US. And we had to raise the standards. So we had to really win on work, not on reputation, because we didn't have one. And then over time, we had these milestones that we would set, these goals that were this brand we want to work with. And we do everything in our power to garner the attention of that brand and work with that brand. And every time we achieved that goal, it gave us another jump up and, I suppose, more authority. And it probably took 2.5 years before we really found our feet in the US.
Mhm.
So it wasn't an overnight success. It was risk, investment, time, dedication, but making sure that we were fixed on where it was worth the reward of entering the US market, because it's an expensive process to do that.
Yeah, an expensive mistake if you get it wrong as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I suppose talking about like the market nuances, I've heard, I believe yourself and other people talk about. Obviously, you've got the UK and the US, but the US in its entirety is not just essentially one country, even though it is. It's made of multiple states. So I suppose then you talk about these cross states and marketing. You know, from New York to Florida to LA is completely different way that you need to speak and market to these customers. So I suppose, how did you go about like sort of understanding how to, you know, sort of educate yourself on the market and the nuances, I suppose?
Yeah, I think our strategy when we entered the US market was helping European brands or UK brands that had US aspirations, and we would go along that journey with them. So that gave us a jumping off point. What we quickly learned is that point around the makeup of the US, the cultural history is very different from state to state, never mind at a macro view. I think a lot of businesses have they tend to have a strategy that is, let's focus on the cultural hotspots. Let's go to New York. Let's go to LA. Let's go coastal, right? Actually, that's a really competitive, expensive thing to do as a brand, to enter those markets. And actually, having a broader understanding of the makeup of the US can be a better business strategy. So how we went about that, I'd love to say we were really thoughtful and intentional about the process. We weren't. It was kind of feel as we go along. But what we did find over time was we started to work with some SMEs. But an SME in the US is like a giant business in the UK. I remember going to Alabama one time to meet a furniture business, and their brief to us was help us sell more things online. And their level of communication and marketing and the work that they were doing on social media was very limited. We went to see them. They're a 350 million turnover business. That's a small SME in Alabama. Right? That's a regional in one state. So you kind of get the perspective of there is a huge amount of opportunity, and ego often leads you to arenas like New York, LA, Miami. And for some businesses, that's the right strategy. If you are a business that's anchored to culture like fashion, music, entertainment, for many others, you know, be a bit more thoughtful about where you enter.
Nice, brilliant. So obviously you had amazing success with Social Chain. Why then did you decide to leave that business, part ways with it, and, you know, set up this venture with Steve? I suppose, what was the rationale behind it? You know, leaving that sort of safe space, a great opportunity in New York as well, to go off and, you know, essentially start something new.
Yeah, I think the start of anything is usually pretty special. Everybody likes the start of romance, friendships, holidays, you name it. The start of thing is special. So there's always a piece of you that wants to do something new. For me personally, I think I'd learned as much as I could, and I sort of maximized my growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't say I was no longer challenged, but I got to a point where my day-to-day felt easier than it should.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big believer growth starts where where comfort ends. So for me, it was really important to get uncomfortable again. And being a delusionally ambitious person myself, I felt I owed it to myself to start again. And could we have the audacity to build something bigger and better